Senator from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss Senate Resolution 195. The vote on a motion to discharge that will be the next pending vote in the Senate. And it's actually a pretty simple bill about very basic concepts. Do you believe in the Constitution or not? Do you believe in the rule of law or not? Do you believe in due process or not? Do you believe that final orders of the United States Supreme Court should be respected or not? Those are the questions at issue on Senate Resolution 195. Our president, President Trump, has entered into an agreement still shrouded in some secrecy with the president of El Salvador, President Bukele, to deport American residents into El Salvador and imprison them in prisons in a country that has been charged by the United States and others with gross human rights violations. The Congress that is in charge of appropriating taxpayer dollars should want to know the circumstances of this imprisonment and whether U.S. law is being followed. The $6 million payment to the Salvadoran prison likely violates human rights law in accord to many experts who've looked at the details as they emerge. And that's where we begin. These are dollars that Congress has appropriated, but the precise mechanism for transfer of these monies and the president's authority to both spend the money and carry out the deportations is questionable. The United States Supreme Court, in the case of one of these individuals who it admits was deported by mistake, and there are many others similarly situated, is defying an order of the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court ruled in a 9-0 ruling that the administration should facilitate the return of Mr. Abrigo Garcia, and as thus far, nearly a month later, that has not occurred. This is about fighting lawlessness. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, to which we all pledge fealty, is pretty straightforward. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That was the clause that the United States Supreme Court unanimously interpreted to mandate the return of Mr. Abrigo Garcia. The president, when asked recently whether he had an obligation to uphold the Constitution that he swore an oath to in the witness of all of us on Inauguration Day, asked if he has to uphold the Constitution just within the last week, said he did not know. We know the answer to that question, but the president does not. The particular country to which these American residents have been deported, El Salvador, now goes back a year, has a track record of imprisoning individuals, innocent individuals. And the last thing any of us should want is an innocent individual in prison, but especially if that innocent individual is an American. But, Mr. President, this is the punchline. The president has indicated that this is not just for those who are here with questions about their legal status. President Trump has said homegrowns are next. Trump doubles down on sending American criminals to foreign prisons. We have a prison system in the United States, local jails, state prisons, federal prisons. The notion of sending American citizens to foreign prisons without scrutiny is truly shocking, and that is the reason that I filed the resolution. What is this resolution? It's a privileged motion available to any senator directing the administration to produce a human rights report about a nation, in this case, El Salvador. Senate Resolution 195 directs the Secretary of State to produce a report to this body that would be available not only to us but to the American public about the human rights record in El Salvador. And a couple of the clauses of the resolution, I think, are specific about this particular case. The report should contain information about the treatment of citizens or residents of other countries, including the United States, non-Salvadorans, who are being detained or imprisoned in El Salvador, including any opportunity provided to such citizens or residents to demonstrate that they're being wrongfully detained or imprisoned. We should all want to know whether Americans detained in El Salvador have an opportunity to demonstrate that they are wrongfully imprisoned. The report will require that. The report would require an assessment from the Secretary of State of the conditions in El Salvador's Centro de Confinamiento de Terrorismo, CICAT, including an assessment of allegations of torture and other gross violations of human rights. Remember again that the Trump administration has acknowledged that at least one of the individuals who was deported mistakenly. He has been in prison for some time. If he's not there now, he was for some time in CICAT. We should want to know whether Americans imprisoned there are subject to torture or other gross violations of human rights. The report should include a description of any actions that the United States government is taking to ensure that the government of the Republic of El Salvador releases U.S. citizens being detained or imprisoned in El Salvador in compliance with United States court orders regarding their return. And finally, the report would require information, a description of actions the U.S. government is taking to provide due process in compliance with U.S. law for relevant persons detained or imprisoned in El Salvador. Why would anyone in this body, understanding this record, the forcible deportation of American residents, some admittedly deported by mistake, whom the Supreme Court has ordered returned into Salvadoran prisons, why would anyone in this body not want to get a human rights report about the conditions of that confinement, particularly given the fact that President Trump has indicated that he may intend next to send United States citizens into those same prisons? This information will be very relevant to important decisions that we take in our relationship with El Salvador and also in decisions that we take with respect to the Appropriations Act. And I urge my colleagues to vote for Senate Resolution 195. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start by thanking my friend and colleague, Senator Kaine, for his longtime leadership in support of human rights and the rule of law. And it's an honor to team up with him in introducing this resolution, which, as he indicated, is designed to expose the truth about a scheme that is threatening the constitutional rights of everybody who lives in the United States of America. Because as we speak, President Trump is paying American taxpayer dollars to the government of El Salvador, which has been a notorious violator of human rights. He's paying them American taxpayer dollars to lock up American residents without due process of law. The Constitution is clear. The Fifth Amendment, and by application to the states, the 14th Amendment, but the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution guarantees due process. And as Senator Kaine indicated, when President Trump was recently asked whether he had to comply with the Constitution of the United States, despite the fact that he put his hand on a Bible and took the oath of office right down the hall here not that long ago, the president's response was, "I don't know." That should concern every single member of the United States Senate, regardless of party. The principle of not depriving somebody of their liberty without due process of law is a fundamental core American value. That is why it's in the Constitution of the United States. This is not a liberal issue. It's not a conservative issue. It's not an issue that belongs to any one party. This is a fundamental American issue in the Constitution of the United States. And I know that Donald Trump wants to continue to change the subject when it comes to this matter, but the subject could not be more clear, and that is to protect the constitutional rights of people who reside in the United States. One person who was caught up in this unconstitutional scheme was Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's a constituent of mine in Maryland, as are his wife, Jennifer, and their children. Federal agents illegally abducted Kilmar Abrego Garcia while he was driving with his 5-year-old son who has autism. They took him to Baltimore, then Texas, and then they shackled him and handcuffed him and put him on a plane. He didn't know where he was going. And next thing he knows, he ends up in El Salvador at this notorious prison called CICOT, which is the gulag of Latin America. The Trump administration admitted in a federal court that they had wrongfully detained Mr. Abrego Garcia. They admitted it. They said it was an administrative error that landed him in CICOT. But what did they do? Instead of fixing that egregious error, they fired the lawyer who told the truth to the court. That's what they did. And since then, they have been ignoring the orders of the district court, the Fourth Circuit, and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, we don't see many of those, in a 9-0 decision, ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Mr. Abrego Garcia in accordance with his rights to due process. Now, if President Trump can ignore the courts, that's a very short road to tyranny. I have made very clear from the start that I'm not vouching for the man, Mr. Abrego Garcia. I am vouching for his rights, because if you deny his rights, you put in jeopardy the rights of everybody who resides in the United States of America. So that's why I did travel to El Salvador, both to meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, to try to find out whether he was dead or alive, report back to his family, but also to ask the government of El Salvador to stop being complicit in this scheme with President Trump to deny residents of the United States their constitutional rights. And when I met with the vice president of El Salvador, my worst fears were reinforced. Because I asked the vice president of El Salvador, why are you holding Mr. Abrego Garcia? Do you have any sort of criminal complaint against him? No, not at all. Why? Because the United States government, the Trump administration, is paying us to do so. That's why. I ultimately got to see Mr. Abrego Garcia. At first, I was stonewalled by the government of El Salvador. And he has been totally unable to contact anybody in the outside world, before I met with him and since. He's in not only a total news blackout, but nobody can call him. Not his lawyers, not his wife, not his mother, not his brother. That is a violation of international law. And that's one of the hallmarks of this El Salvadorian gulag, is people go into CICOT or these other prisons, and you never hear from them again. The State Department 2023 Human Rights Report on El Salvador, the most recent one we have, reported credible reports of cruel, inhuman, or degrading torture in El Salvadorian prisons, including beatings with batons and rifles, overcrowding, underfeeding, and life-threatening medical neglect. Reports that guards fire stun guns on wet floors to deliver electric shock to the entire cell at once. That's where we're sending people like Abrego Garcia without any due process of law. And that is why it's so important that we adopt this resolution, which Senator Kaine has so well described. And I would urge my Republican colleagues to stand back and think of the moment we're in. Because not only did the President of the United States say he wasn't sure if he had to comply with the Constitution of the United States, which should set off alarm bells all over the country, regardless of party, but Steve Miller, one of his top policy advisors, publicly talked about suspending habeas corpus, suspending the Constitution of the United States. Mr. President, that is a very dangerous idea. And all of us, regardless of party, should stand up to protect the Constitution, to protect due process, and to make it clear that the President of the United States cannot ignore a 9-0 Supreme Court order, which he is doing as we speak. Because if he can do it with one person or do it to two people, he can do it to anybody in the United States of America. And that is un-American. And I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first want to begin by thanking my colleagues, Senator Kaine, Senator Van Hollen. I believe Senator Schumer will be joining us for this important issue. I want to thank them for their efforts to provide some needed moral clarity at this critical time. Now, earlier this year, hope you've seen the news reports that all across the country there were stories of families waking up to learn that their loved ones had disappeared. A husband with no criminal record detained after a routine immigration appointment, complying with the conditions of his status at the moment. Another instance of a makeup artist who had fled Venezuela after being targeted for his sexual orientation and political views, one day gone simply for having crown tattoos in honor of his parents. A mother who learned the whereabouts of her son only when she saw his face on propaganda videos released by El Salvador. Mr. President, over 200 migrants were sent to El Salvador's notorious high-security prison known as CICAT. By the way, that includes 8 women who the Trump administration mistakenly flew to the all-male prison only to have to fly them back. But hundreds of men have been sent to prison with no trial even. No sentence, no end date, no communication with the outside world. Now, let me be the first to say, and I think I speak on behalf of my colleagues when I say that if you have committed a crime in the United States of America, then yes, you deserve to be prosecuted. But as we all know, and I hope we continue to respect, that we have a justice system to do just that. A justice system that has a process for those charged with a crime to be found guilty or innocent. Because yes, you actually have to be found guilty in a court to be guilty. Now that shouldn't be controversial. Anybody who claims to be for, quote, law and order has to be both for law and order. You can't just overlook the law part of the slogan. But Republicans continue to leave out that fact, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of those deported had no criminal records. A report from 60 Minutes just last month showed that 75% of those deported to CICAT had no criminal record. These were people who in many cases had pending asylum cases or some other sort of immigration protection. But simply because they may have tattoos, the Trump administration has decided to use them for a poorly executed and expensive publicity stunt. As I think Senator Van Hollen began to explain to us, if Republicans allow Donald Trump to make himself judge, jury, and executioner, then we're all in trouble. This is the behavior of a foreign dictator, not the President of the United States. A dictator wishes to do away with due process and disappearing loved ones to foreign countries without a trace. Now, this administration is violating federal law by sending people to places like CICAT, and soon, maybe Libya, where they may very well face torture or some other horrific treatment. And for anybody who thinks that this may not concern them because you're an American citizen, think again. You may not actually be given an opportunity to prove your citizenship before you're sent away. Donald Trump has said publicly that he wants to imprison American citizens in El Salvador next. Not my words, his. And so there is no telling where all of this is going to lead. Now, we have seen federal courts time and again rebuff the Trump administration's lawlessness and order them to take steps to return wrongfully deported migrants. But we've also seen the Trump administration continue to resist and ignore court orders. So, colleagues, the resolution before us today would force the Trump administration to start opening up the books, to tell us what meaningful actions they are taking to comply, to be accountable to the American people. And yes, to demand that the administration publish a report on the human rights violations being committed by the country that Trump is so willingly embracing. But it also does another thing. It puts us all on the record, because history will judge not only those who willingly embraced the erosion of civil rights that's happening, but it will also judge those who chose to sit back and watch it happen over and over again. Every member of this body has to decide whether they will stand up and demand answers from the administration or to sit silently while Trump imprisons innocent men. This is more than just about immigrants or immigration. This is about due process. This is about civil rights. This is about the foundation of our liberties. And I urge my colleagues to join us in holding this administration accountable. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from Virginia.
I will conclude prior to the vote just by saying this is a very basic resolution. Everyone in this body, knowing that Americans have been deported without due process into a prison in a foreign country that has a grievous record of human rights abuses, should at least want to get information about the circumstances of that confinement, about whether that prison is according American residents any semblance of due process, and whether the United States is undertaking efforts to ensure that that country and that prison is following final orders of the United States Supreme Court. If you support the rule of law, if you support due process, if you support the Constitution, if you support human rights, if you support final orders of the United States Supreme Court, you will support Senate Resolution 195, and I now ask for the vote.